Right, welcome back to another web development and video where I'll show you how to make modern websites using HTML5, CSS3, and a little bit of JavaScript. In this video, we are going to use CSS Grid to make this layout here. And what I want to really focus on is how we can get this, what you call it, a callout or a quote, kind of a block quote, into the structure as well as having responsive columns, and this is also going to be responsive inside the layout, so the layout will switch up and change a little bit. When we get finished, this is what we're going to wind up with, and you can see we turn on our responsive. Hopefully this will work. It hasn't been working much in Codepen, so let's go here. So we're starting with you can see our call out in the center here, and then we go from automatically from one column to two columns, and then at the 670 mark we start to move into our call out down at the bottom. Eventually these will split off into 4 columns, and then at 1,000 pixels I just kind of have it situated that it doesn't go any wider than that. So that's what we're looking to create, and mostly what I'm thinking is, how can we turn this static layout into something that is design responsive or viewport responsive. So that's a lot of the things that I've really been trying to focus on, is how can we how can we raise the level of design to what we see in print pieces, but for the web. And so hopefully this will give you a little better sense for not only column structures and how we can lay out this particular thing, but also how reflowing content and positioning content inside CSS Grid works. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to pull up our code, and let me just get this prepped real quick off screen. Okay, so again, this is no JavaScript, this is all just CSS, and let's get rid of this. And so now we have a blank slate and we're going to go in and we're just going to create a grid. We're going to call it grid, and this is going to be our wrapper grid that we attach that we call display grid on. And then we have 2 columns, so we have column 1, and we're also going to call it text. And then we have column 2, and we're also going to give it a class of text. And then the last thing that we have is a callout. So we have our 3 items, and you can see we have column 1, so it's going to be this section. Column 2 is all of this, and then we have our callout section as well. Alright, and the first thing we need to do is try to build this mobile responsively, which should help us a little bit. Let's get some text. I have a little side project called Meaningful Ipsum. You can go to myname.github.io/meaningful-ipsum, and essentially you'll be met with a page like this, and then you can choose one of these famous stories and get some real lorem ipsum text. These are just first chapters of all of these famous books, and so I'm just going to go ahead and grab a couple paragraphs here and put it in. So let's just put our p tags, and we have one paragraph there, or one column there. And then for the second column, I'll just take a couple more small paragraphs and put that down here. So now we have our 2 paragraphs of text. It looks like one big long piece of text, which is exactly what we want. The only thing dividing it is this div right here. And then last we have our callout. So what I'm going to do is just come in and grab a little piece of text up here. So a callout usually calls out something that's actually inside the text, so I don't want to go and get more. I just want to grab something inside the text. And for this I'm going to use an H1 just to give it a little bit of pop. So you can see here we have our H1. Okay, so we have all three of our elements together. We have our column 1, column 2, and then we have our callout. And this could be okay for right now, but what I really want to do is to take this callout and I want to move it up to this section here in between the two columns. Now I could make this happen just like this, and this would be fine if you wanted to go that route, because now your callout just at a mobile first stage is right here. I'm going to do it a different way, and what I'm going to do, one of the things I don't like about that is it will interrupt the flow of the HTML if someone is using a reader or this is being read out loud to them. It'll actually interrupt the flow of the HTML. And what I want to do is I want to make my HTML readable and more easily readable. And this callout, really, if it never happens, it's not a big deal. It's more of a visual sort of thing than it is necessary for the HTML. It's more necessary for my HTML to be flowing from one paragraph to another. So that's why I'm going to choose to put the callout down here. And thankfully, with the CSS Grid, we can visually reorder our elements very easily. So that's a really nice thing. Okay. First thing, let's just establish our grid, and I'm going to put a little padding around that. So now we have some padding here. There's not going to be any padding necessarily. Well, there is going to be, but there won't be any margin. So padding, and then we're going to say display grid, and then we're going to say grid template columns, and we're just going to do one FR. So we just want it to take up all the available space, so just one column. You can see that. And we don't want to establish any rows. We want it to automatically lay out and flow. And at this point, I don't know that we need any grid gap, but we'll try to work with that whenever we get to it. Alright, and the next thing that we want to do is we want to move our callout up. So now that we have the grid in place, we can actually move this callout up, because the callout is a part of the grid. It will actually allow us to use the grid columns and the grid rows structure to move and manipulate that element. So we say callout, and at small sizes we want the callout to be grid column 1, and we want it to be grid row 2. And you can see automatically that brings it up the page. So this is the declaration that moves it. So right now we have one column, or I'm sorry, one row, 2 rows, 3 rows. So each element represents a row inside the grid, because we have a single column. So these are not being split out into columns yet. So we take out of the 3rd row and we insert it into the 2nd row, and when you do that, it automatically reflows the grid around your the elements that you specifically place into parts of the grid. So whenever we're looking at a design like this, we can see that we can anchor pieces or elements into the flow of the grid, and the rest of the grid is going to flow around it. So that's a really powerful piece. You can place each one of these by itself, and we'll have to do that in just a minute when we get out to larger sizes. But at this point, everything here is really nice. I'm going to go ahead and style this call out. I'm going to say background is going to be black, and the color is going to be sort of a light gray. This is why I didn't want to do any padding here. I'll put it on the text so you can see it brings us back up here, but I don't want to put it on the outside of this. I want this to go flush all the way across, and then I want the padding to be on the inside. So we'll add that now. Let's do something sort of nice and airy, I guess is the best word. Let's style our H1. Our H1 should have the color, actually. So let's do that. And then we're also going to take our margin off. So you're going to see it shrinks up a little bit, which means that we should maybe do a little bit more on the top and bottom. And then we could say align height of 1.2 or something. It was already at 1. Okay. And just pull that together a little bit more. And that looks pretty good to me. We could afford to have a little bit more space here and here if we wanted to, but you can see that even at smallest sizes that it looks good. So we have some nice padding around here. I want to change the font size to 1.5. Okay, so we'll pull the font size down a little bit. This is like a normal average phone right here, and so we're just going to leave it like that, and it's going to look pretty good until we get up into this range, which is, you know, maybe 500 pixels or so. And at 500 pixels I want this to be a little bit bigger, so we can just take this and copy it, and then we can say at media and a minimum width of 500 pixels. Our H1 element is going to change its size. So let's say 2. It bumps up to 2 rem, which I like, and the line height needs to be reflected as well. And that's going to be 1.3, 2, 1. Just a little bit more. I feel like I'm getting a little bit of play here. I don't want those to all of a sudden be running into one another, so just a little bit more space, more than the 1, and then that should get us there pretty well. And so what we want in our example, we had these columns splitting out, and so let's go ahead and take care of our columns. And we can actually create responsive columns of text, or text and images, or whatever they are, inside of CSS. So if we grab our text elements, if you remember those are our columns, our text elements, we're going to say columns 2. Now what that does is automatically splits them into 2, and it just keeps them at 2 forever. So if you want that sort of look, that even at smaller sizes you have a nice like skinny columns, you can keep that. I don't like that personally, so I'm going to put a column width on there of, let's say, 200 pixels. So now, because this text hasn't reached, the columns haven't reached 200 pixels, then they don't split. They only split when you get to each column has 200 pixels of space. So that happens right here, about 450 pixels. We finally get our splitting of columns. So this is going to be a 200 pixel column, and this is a 200 pixel column, and it just needs to have enough space in order to do that. And you see, once it gets there, then it just kind of keeps that structure for as long as you want, and it just keeps getting wider and wider. At a breakpoint, we're going to set another breakpoint where we kind of restructure all this, and so it's not going to feel like you have these big, huge, wide columns. But feel free to play around with columns. They're really great. They're easy to use, and I don't know. It's one of those kind of unsung CSS properties that I don't see a lot of people using necessarily, but it makes for a really nice piece of text. Okay, what we need to do when we do columns, we have to be aware that all of our p tags, if we're using p tags, have a little bit of margin on the top. So there's margin here and there's margin here. Margin looks go okay here because it's supposed to be there, you know, between these two lines. But we want to take away the first. So when we say text p and the first of the type, so that means the first of the p elements, we're going to say margin top of 0, and then that just takes, it doesn't do it to the second or third or fourth, it only does it to the first p element in that section. And then for the text, let's put a little padding on here. That's where we're going to get our padding all around. So now we have these nice columns that start here. You could even add like a large capital letter where you start the sentence. Initial cap is what they call it. And then, you know, you could do the same thing down here, just let everything kind of flow down the page. So right now this is what we have. So we have a nice single flow whenever it's a small size, and then as we start to get up in our viewport sizes, then we get a nice little column structure with a little call out. So even that right there, you can see that it's not very much HTML in order to get us to that place. I mean CSS, and the HTML is still very straightforward. We haven't had to manipulate it or change it or add a bunch of classes to it. So CSS Grid really makes it super easy to do this sort of thing. And then now what we want to do is when we get out to, I believe it's 675, so this size here, what we want to do is we want to start shifting this layout around so that we get something more like this. So we're going to have a one column here, we're going to have a one column here, and then this piece is going to situate itself to the bottom and to the right of our two column structure. So let's look at how we can do that using CSS Grid. So we're going to have to manipulate our grid to have two columns at that point. So we make a media query. So at media, and the minimum width is 675 pixels. Then we're going to say grid, and then we'll just copy this. We don't need to re-declare the grid, we just need to change the elements that we want to change. And that's that we want to have a two column structure. Okay, so now we do. And what this is doing, since we have three elements, it's saying this is column 1, this is column 2, and then it flows the elements down to the next row because we only have room for two elements at a time. If we were to add another column, you could see that it would line them up next to one another, maybe. Oh, we still have our declaration for the callout. So if we get rid of that, there we go. We had our declaration already, and this is actually kind of cool looking. I haven't tried that. But you can see the different things. So we have three elements, three columns, and once we get out to that side, we have three columns. So that's how the column structures work with CSS Grid. So we're out in this space here, and what we want to do is we want to bring this up to this space here. Let's get rid of this extra column as well. So we want to bring this up into this space. And so we need to start working on our columns, and we have those columns marked out as column 1 and column 2, and then we have our call out already in the CSS. So let's work on column 1. And what we want column 1 to do is to just be grid column 1, grid row 1. And so nothing is going to change with that because of the source order in the HTML, it's already grid column 1, grid row 1. So it's even a declaration we don't necessarily need. I don't mind putting it in there. And then for our second column here, we need this column to be grid row or grid column 2, and we need it to be in grid row 1. So we say column 2 is grid column 2 and grid row 1. Again, nothing is going to necessarily change because that's the flow of the page. The flow of the page is grid column 2, grid row 1. We don't have to really make those declarations, and I'll get rid of them in just a minute, but I'm just trying to show you how everything would work if we needed to relay out things. So this is our next piece. We go to the callout and we say at media and a minimum width of 675 pixels. I guess we should add that. Could add that declaration here too. And then we'll just move all these things up so that those things happen whenever we get to 675. So we need that. And we come down here and we say callout is going to be grid. Let's just copy this. It's going to be grid column 2 because we want it into the second column. You can see that it's in grid column 2. And then we want it to be in grid row 2. So this is in exactly the right place that we need, but because this is all row 1 and this is all row 2, it's pushing everything down because it's relatively positioned in that way. So what we can do is if we make this column span 2 rows, it should pull everything up. So we go back to here and we say grid row 1, and then we can do this a couple of ways. We can say 1 to 3, and then that spans 2 columns, or we could say span 2, and that means span 2 rows. So start in grid row 1 or at the track, the very first grid row line for grid row 1, and then span 2 lines. So it spans 1 line, 2 lines. So that's essentially how our spans work. So you can span as many columns as you want to span. But for this layout, we just needed to span 2 columns. So if you're familiar with the way that CSS tables work, where you need to sometimes span over elements, you need to span from one TD to another, or from one TR to another. It works very similarly to that. So you're just spanning over the rows, and then that brings up row 2. So you can see that this is all row 1, and now row 2 is here. This just happens to be in the middle of row 2. Alright, we're pretty close to being there. We can give this call out just a little bit of margin to try to bring it in a little bit, to bring it back in line here and here. We can give it just a little bit of margin. That frees it up a little bit. And we're pretty close to being there at this point. You can see that it sticks to the bottom right, and now we have 1 column here, 1 column here. It looks like 4 continuous columns, but you're controlling the space. So this is a little bit of an issue down here that if someone were really paying attention to it, they would say, well, this is either a widow or an orphan, or something is not right with this. But I think you could fool a lot of just the general public with that. But if someone knows what they're doing with magazine layouts or newspaper layout, they would know that there's an issue here. Or maybe you just tried to get rid of this widow or orphan down here. I don't know. Because theoretically, all of this right here should be flowing down here in some particular way. Alright, so we have our elements here. And I just want to put a maximum width on the grid. And we're going to say a grid with a max width of 1000 pixels, not 100. And we're going to say margin of 2 rem and then auto on the sides. So that gives us like 2 rem of margin, you know, against whatever the next element is, and then obviously it just stays centered in the middle. So you have this nice little call out, and we have our 4-column structure. But when we start to move down, our columns start to shift a little bit. We still have our call on our columns to be 200 pixels wide. So when they are no longer 200 pixels wide, they come together into 2 columns. But everything is retained, our initial shape is retained. And then once we get down below 675, then we split back into 2 columns, like for phablets or I don't know, smaller tablets, maybe 7-inch tablets would probably take on this size. And then once you get down into phone sizes, then our columns come back together, and we have our 1-column structure that feels very natural, and we have our call out in the middle. And when we go to our HTML, we've not had to touch our HTML at all. Our HTML stays presentable. It stays with the most important text at the beginning, and then with the call out text at the end where it should be, because this is part of all this text. It's not an integral new piece of text that we are introducing. So if that doesn't get read, or if it gets read last, it's not a big deal. Someone might just say, oh, well, that is kind of that's sort of an important piece of text maybe, but not, it's more integral to the visual piece than it is to the reading piece. All right, well, that is responsive columns with a callout section using CSS Grid. I hope that I went slow enough that it is that you understand what was happening whenever we were moving the callout section around and how everything flows around one another. When you intentionally put something in a particular place on the grid, everything else should flow around it, and the CSS does a lot of the hard work for you. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section below. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. If you want to reach out to me to ask questions or connect, I'm on Twitter at Brian Hafferkamp. And I think that's all for today. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.